Okay. Good evening, everyone. The name is Adeyemi Aremu. I'm the president of South African Association of Botanists. I really want to welcome you all to our first seminar for 2024. I think it's a good time to meet after the event in Zululand, our annual conference. So this evening, I think the number is still increasing, but because we don't want to keep people here, I think we just want to start immediately. And Anila is going to do the formal intro welcome, but I just want to thank Prof. Brian for actually agreeing to speak to us today. We really appreciate you so much. We're looking forward to your presentation. Anila, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. We're very happy to welcome you to our first webinar for this year, and we'll have a series of these throughout the year. So please keep an eye out for the adverts of the next ones as well. Before I start with the introduction, I just want to remind everybody to please keep your cameras and sound microphones off during the webinar so that we don't have disturbances. But please feel free to start posting your questions if you want to. So you can post questions in the chat box, and we'll attend to them at the end. Otherwise, you're also welcome to raise your hand at the end of the webinar and ask your questions. We'd really like that interaction as well. For those that want SACNAS points, remember to make a note in the chat box. I think, Elizabeth, is that right? So that we can make sure that you get awarded those points. All right, I hope that's all the housekeeping things. So it is really an honor to introduce the SAAB community to Prof. Brian van Wilgen. He's absolutely one of the giants in fire management and alien invasive species management in South Africa, but also internationally. I think half of the papers that my students have to read is a Van Wilgen work of art. So Prof. Van Wilgen started with in the field of forestry with a degree from Stellenbosch University, and then eventually a PhD from UCT. And Prof. Van Wilgen worked in the Department of Forestry for about 15 years, and then for 25 years in the CSIR, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. And then in 2014, he joined Stellenbosch University. And throughout his career, he's managed many large multidisciplinary projects in fire management and impact assessments, among others. And Prof. Van Wilgen also played a major role in the Working for Water program, both as project manager and scientific advisor. And this program combats the alien plant invasives, as well as the massive unemployment issue that we have in South Africa. Currently, he's a core member of the Center of Excellence for Invasion Biology at Stellenbosch University. And yeah, Prof. Van Wilgen has literally been labeled as one of the legends of South African science by ASAF, the Academy for Science of South Africa. And he's won numerous awards for his massive contribution to science, conservation, and fire and alien management, and still today works in these fields. So it's really a pleasure that you can share your wisdom with us today. And today, Prof. Van Wilgen will be telling us about the massive complexity around some of our worst invasive species and how we need to use multidisciplinary approaches to seek solutions for these. So thank you very much, Prof. Van Wilgen, for your time, and please go ahead with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Anina, for those kind words. when I was asked to talk at this seminar, I decided to talk about a project that I've been involved in for the past 10 years now. And that's looking at the invasions of prosopis trees across Eastern Africa. Oh dear. Okay. So this photograph was taken near Lake Baringo in northeastern Kenya about 4 years ago. And everything that you see there, except the one tall tree in the background, is prosopis trees. And there's no grass on the ground. And this is what's happening in many areas across Eastern Africa. It's a tree that was introduced intentionally to provide a whole range of benefits, and it became invasive. And this story is about what we're trying to do about it, both with research and management. So if you go back almost 40 years now, more than 40 years, if you look at the SCOPE program on alien invasives, that was maybe the starting point of modern invasion biology. That program put out a challenge by asking the research community to investigate three factors. You know, what species will become invasive? What features make ecosystems prone or resistant to invasion? And how can we use this knowledge to develop management system to better manage the problem? And in fact, after 40 years, there's still very few examples of truly transdisciplinary studies that actually deliberately set out to work across boundaries and to try to find ways to manage these invasions. So if we go back to the start of the problem in Eastern Africa, around about the 1960s, early 1970s, there was widespread land degradation in most of the semi-arid parts of that part of Africa. There was a lot of erosion. There was a lot of rangeland carrying capacity being lost due to overgrazing. There were shortages of fuel wood to, because of overfelling of trees in that area. And something had to be done. So the solution at that time was to introduce a wonder tree, something that would survive well in arid environments, that would prevent erosion, that would provide shade and fodder for livestock, that would act as a source of timber and fuel wood, mediate microclimates, enhance soil fertility. Sounds wonderful. What a great idea. So they brought in Prosopis tuliflora from Central America that would provide all of these benefits. And that solution, of course, led to the next problem, which is that the Prosopis trees became invasive and they spread far beyond. They didn't stay where we put them. They spread far beyond their original plantings. They formed dense thickets and started to have impacts on water resources, biodiversity, and rangelands. Now, this is it's a complex problem because some people benefit from having these trees there. They use the pods for fodder and they make charcoal. And other people suffer the costs of invasions. And it's complex because these net values of how many people suffer and how many people benefit change rapidly over time. And perceptions don't always change as fast as the situation changes. It's also complex because there are no clear solutions to this problem. So that begs the next question, where's the next solution to this problem going to come from? And there's a lot of questions that need to be answered. Can we retain some of these benefits but reduce the costs? Can we control spread by utilizing the resources that are on offer from this tree? Where should we focus our management efforts and what technologies should we employ? And what is possible? What will it cost and who will pay? So these are really complex questions that demand some kind of integrated solution. So this is this program that I was involved in. It was funded by the Swiss government. And this program deliberately set out to integrate knowledge across multiple disciplines and to involve potential end users right at the beginning of the project. It ran for 7 years. In fact, it's still going now. It started 2015, ran officially till 2022, but additional funding has kept it going since then. Its overall goal was to mitigate the negative effects of Prosopis juliflora, but there were some specific goals which to generate and share knowledge on how these species establish and spread, what their effects and impacts were in different contexts in different countries in East Africa, and to develop methods to improve measures for controlling them. So this is where we were we were working. We had 3 principal study sites, one in the Afar region in Ethiopia, where Prosopis invasions were causing a lot of ethnic conflict in that region. Lake Baringo district in Kenya, where in fact the degradation brought about by this tree resulted in lawsuits against the government, and I'll come back to that. And in the Moshi district in Tanzania, just below Mount Kilimanjaro there, where the trees planted in Kenya have now spread across the border and are starting to invade in Tanzania. So there were a number of broad principles that we applied in this project, and this is an important slide, so you can pay attention here. The idea was to collect data across all disciplines at the same sites at the same time, using a nested sample design. So what you often find is when you're confronted with a problem and you look for information, you find someone's done a study somewhere on the impacts on biodiversity, someone has done a study somewhere else at a different scale on the impacts on water, and somebody else has done another study somewhere else on social attitudes. And when you come to put those studies together, they don't always match. So it's important to have all these disciplines focusing on the same site at the same time. And then to take that information and integrate it and upscale it to a landscape or a national scale, to actively train students in inter and transdisciplinary work. And so there were about 10 PhD and about 10 master's students on the project over this time. And each PhD student was required as part of their funding to publish at least one paper with at least one other PhD student who came from a different discipline. And this worked very well because it forced the guys to talk to each other and to look at each other's results and see how those results were relevant to the work that they were doing. And the other thing was to actively involve end users and policymakers throughout this project, not just at the end or halfway through or whatever. They were involved in the beginning in setting it up, constantly consulted throughout the project, and brought together at the end. So this is some of our students at one of the project meetings. So we held project meetings at least twice a year in one of the study site areas. This one was in Ethiopia. And there were students there from different disciplines: ecology, genetics, hydrology, economics, social science, remote sensing, and so on. This is a diagram that was drawn up about data sharing from different disciplines. So this is the amount of information that flowed between students providing data at the top from different disciplines, and then how much of that data was used in papers that addressed those disciplines at the bottom there. So this really worked quite well during the project. So what we've actually learned during the project, I want to look at the history of introduction and spread, how this plant has impacted on ecosystems, what the appropriate and available management options are, and what the challenges are in future. So with regard to the introduction and spread, I can't see the dates on the side of my screen here, but as you can see, the green dots are the native distribution of the genus Prosopis in the Americas, and the blue dots are the current distribution of Prosopis juliflora across Africa, Asia, and Australia, where it is highly invasive in all of those places. So South Africa was one of the first countries to introduce Prosopis in the late 1880s, and then it moved from there to Namibia, the Sudan, Kenya, Ethiopia, and so on, and then spread to Tanzania. But the important thing to know about this is that there was some very aggressive spreading of this plant. There were aeroplanes put up after the Second World War with bags of seeds, and they flew along arid rivers and just tossed these seeds out as far as they went. So there was a very, very active campaign of spreading this, and farmers in South Africa and Kenya and all over the place were encouraged by the government to plant this tree. We had some genetic studies done, and the interesting thing here is that there were two Prosopis trees in Kenya. One was Prosopis pallida, the other one Prosopis juliflora. Pallida was not invasive, did not become invasive, but juliflora did. And there was evidence that it was not the hybrids that were invading, it was the pure juliflora, and it demonstrated a lot of phenotypic plasticity as well as post-rapid evolution. So there was evidence that we found that after it arrived there, it was evolving. And it was easy to do this because we could still trace the original trees that were planted, and we could then compare them to trees that were invading some distance away. This is a typical scene below a Prosopis tree. Lots and lots of pods. Goats and cattle feed on these pods, and wildlife and donkeys and camels. And they spread it as far as they go in their dung. So the seeds pass through their gut and are deposited further away. So wherever you get movement of livestock or wildlife, you get spread of this tree. Here is a remote sensing study that was done around Lake Baringo in Western Kenya. And the first slide shows you can you see my cursor? I hope you can. This is the Prosopis trees, the little red bits here, planted around Lake Baringo, which then slowly spread and then spread more rapidly until by 2016 it came to dominate the entire area south of this lake. This is a similar picture using remote sensing along the Awash River in Ethiopia between 1986 and 2017, where again you see very little Prosopis trees in 1986. And then by 2000, they had started to show up, and by 27, they had become widespread and dominant. So the intended benefit... Gus, that's not appropriate. That's my dog. Okay. The intended benefit was to have a nice tree that would provide shade, would provide pods for livestock to eat and so on, as depicted on the left. But the resultant impact was just dense thickets of thorny bushes that had no grass underneath them, and that livestock could not get through under any circumstances. So if we look at these impacts in diversity, water resources, rangeland carrying capacity, and livelihoods of local pastoralists, these are all studies that were carried out. First of all, we were quite slow as invasion ecologists to actually do studies on the impact of invasive species. So in 1996, the first paper appeared that looked at the impacts of Prosopis stands on dung beetles, done by Steenkamp and Chown. But it wasn't until about 2012 that people started to take this seriously. And then you can see there were a whole lot of studies between 2012 and 2022 that documented the impacts of Prosopis, not only in South Africa, but also in Namibia, Ethiopia, Kenya, and there's even one study from Mali. Now, if you look at a Prosopis stand, it's quite easy to see that there's an impact on biodiversity. There's nothing there but Prosopis and its leaves on the ground. And that's why people, I think, neglected these impact studies, because it was so obvious that these things displace all the biodiversity. So our students have been looking at this quite carefully. And here are some examples. The top graph there shows you native plant species going down on plots as the basal area of Prosopis increases. This is one work done by our PhD student, Ross Shackleton. And the bottom graph shows you herbivorous invertebrate abundance decreasing as Prosopis cover increases. And that was done by Theo Linders, another of our PhD students. So these studies have shown that it's trees, shrubs, grasses, mammals, birds, invertebrates, and even microbial organisms are basically eliminated by dense stands of these trees. Rangeland carrying capacity is reduced, mainly because there are drastic reductions in the cover of important pasture grasses. There's no grass, and a lot of these animals rely on grass to eat. Livestock can have a certain percentage of Prosopis pods in their diet, but they can't eat 100% Prosopis pods. So in places, there's been up to an 80% loss of livestock numbers, many injuries due to thorns, excessive consumption leading to toxic effects. The photograph there shows a goat that has lost its teeth as a result of eating Prosopis pods. And there's also been a shift in the makeup of livestock herds from cattle to goats and camels. And cattle are actually both more profitable and culturally important in many parts of Africa. So this is a very negative impact. Here's some figures around pastoralists, agropastoralists numbering 30 million people, generating a lot of income for the economy. The fact that they have to often move between seasonal grazing areas that are sometimes quite far apart is a problem, because these areas are becoming fragmented due to either conversion to crops or wildlife conservation areas, fencing, and invasion by Prosopis trees. So overall, there's been a loss of grazing, a loss of livestock, generational conflict. And the last point here is a loss of control of livelihoods, where people that we interviewed felt that they weren't in control anymore. This tree had taken over. As one of them said, we don't determine what we do anymore. Life just happens to us. And that's what happens to a lot of poor people across the invaded area. Here's some photographs I took again in Ethiopia, where the government has sold a lot of the land off to irrigated crops like sugarcane. Those are areas that the nomadic pastoralists used to use for seasonal grazing. And to compensate the pastoralists, they put up these permanent water points, which you can see in the background there, to provide water, and they planted Prosopis trees to provide fodder. And these poor guys have to now sit on one spot and try and make a living there. And as you can see in the lower photograph, there's not much in the way of grazing left in those areas. Impacts on water resources. Here's a rainfall map from Eastern Africa. So if you look at the Horn of Africa here, most of Ethiopia, a large proportion of Ethiopia, a large proportion of northern Kenya, and into parts of Tanzania are semi-arid. And this is surveys mainly by Arne Witt, who worked for Kabi in Nairobi, where he either trees or where Prosopis trees had been recorded. And you'll see that they tend to occur along the edge of the arid areas. However, this Horn of Africa was not surveyed because it's actually too dangerous to travel around there and do surveys. So there's a lot of Prosopis in this area, but we just don't have data on that. Now, the features of Prosopis are such that they can really make the most use of water. So they have these extensive and very deep taproots, in one case over 50 meters deep, a taproot. And then they have lateral roots, which are able to capture rainwater quite rapidly. So in the good times when it's raining, these lateral roots will take up water. And in the drought or dry part times of the year, they are able to tap into groundwater and use that. And they're able to switch between the two as circumstances demand. But what I didn't know about, which I find quite fascinating actually, is this hydraulic redistribution. So when you're in a dry period, the taproot will actually take up water and release it in the surface here so that the lateral roots can take it up. And during the rainy season, the lateral roots will take up water and send them down the taproot so that it can replenish the water table, which I found was quite fascinating. But all of this means that this tree can outcompete just about anything else in the environment. So here's an example of a well in Djibouti, which is a country next door to Ethiopia on the coast. And as you can see, there's heavily invaded by prosopis shrubs in the background, and this well simply dried up. There's some serious economic consequences here. These bar graphs show the difference in transpiration rate between prosopis and different indigenous trees. So here you have Prosopis glandulosa and Vachellia karoo, which used to be called acacia karoo until the Australians thought they should keep the name acacia for themselves. But acacia or Vachellia karoo uses very much less water than Prosopis. And here again, Prosopis and Senegalia, Senegal, which also used to be called Acacia Senegal, again using more than twice as much water. And the economic studies have shown that if you just use the price of water, the extra water that those trees use is about $500,000 US per year. However, if you use another way of looking at it, if you say how much cotton or sugar could I produce with the amount of water they use, then that crop would be worth $400 million US per year. That's several orders of magnitude greater. So it just shows you what the effect of how you price water is on how big the impact might appear to be. Impacts on livelihoods. Yes, if you introduce prosopis trees to an area, the initial impact is positive, but it's only positive up until a certain level. And beyond that, it becomes negative. It varies between communities and it changes over time, but the aggregated cost is large, as you can see from the figures here. And the last one is an estimate based on our studies that it could escalate to more than $7 trillion US in 3 East African countries over the next 30 years. So one of our PhD students, an economist, he used household consumption as an indicator of livelihood and well-being. So the theory here is that the more a household is able to spend, the better off that household is. You know, they've got useful income. And he interviewed people living in areas that had varying densities of prosopis cover in them. And found was that the per capita household consumption went up as prosopis started to cover more of the area until it got to a point, and that point was 22% prosopis cover. And after that, the household consumption levels went down. So this indicates that if only we could keep prosopis trees at 22% cover, we would maximize the benefits and minimize the losses. But of course, that's not possible. You can't tell the tree to stop spreading when it gets to 22%. So the residents at Lake Baringo, where the government had aggressively gone on a planting campaign, they took the Kenyan government to court. and they sought redress for the losses that they suffered because the government had introduced this tree. And what you see here in the photograph is somebody taking a toothless goat to the court in Nairobi to show the judges what happens to their livestock after the invasion by Prosopis. And that Kenyan court found that the government was liable and that it had to compensate the community. Well, that never happened, which is really quite sad. The government's ignoring the court orders as the first sign that things are not going well. But what the government did instead was they instituted they subsidized the charcoal making project in an attempt to add value. They said, look, here's some kilns, you can use this and you can make money out of charcoal. We also looked at a One Health approach, and this One Health approach seems to provide a holistic assessment of the environment by considering these four aspects: human health, animal health, plant health, and environmental health. Now, simply put, Prosopis is useful in many contexts. Here, this photograph I took it was in Tanzania, where this tree had recently spread across the border, and here's somebody harvesting a lot of firewood that he would either use or sell that comes from Prosopis trees. On the other hand, there's a lot of negative health impacts. It's a thorny tree, and people are always getting injuries from these thorns. And in fact, there's been a few cases of limbs having had to be amputated as a result of these injuries. So if you look at the scorecard for animal health, for One Health, and you look at for people, animals, plants, and environment, you can see on the positive side there are some positives. There's fodder, there's pods, there's charcoal, there's some fodder value for animals. The plants do fix nitrogen. Whether that's a benefit or not is arguable. And there's some carbon sequestration in degraded areas, although that is also arguable. But if you go to the negative side, there's a much longer list of negatives to having Prosopis invasions in the area. And we used this information to calculate a One Health score. And here we have the One Health scores that we calculated for 4 different environments: pristine, degraded, and then degraded but lightly invaded following introduction of Prosopis, and then heavily invaded. And as you can see, pristine environments deliver the best health score. Once they become degraded, their health score becomes negative. In other words, there's more harm than there is benefit. If you introduce Prosopis trees to this situation, you do improve the situation slightly. So your health score becomes positive again, but that only is for a while. And once they become invasive, the health score declines rapidly with heavily invaded areas. So this is what happens. If you look at a net value, if you're above the line, it means that your benefits are more than the costs. If you are below the line, it means that your cost benefits. And you can see that following introduction, the benefits grow as the trees grow initially and provide benefits. They do provide some fodder, some shade, some firewood, and then they reach a point where the negatives start to outweigh the positives, and we go to a point over here where we're now in negative territory. The cost of the harm is more than the benefits that it delivers. Now, the problem here is that people's perceptions, indicated by the red line, tend to lag. And this has been established by having interviews with many households across the invaded areas. So people only start to have negative feelings about this tree when they reach a point where the overall negative impacts become negative. The overall net impacts become negative. And what also happens later on in this thing is that you get a divergence. There's a group of people, NGOs, who think this is a useful thing to do, and charcoal makers particularly, who have positive attitudes because they do benefit from it, and then everybody else that has negative attitudes towards it. And here's the third problem, is the cost of control. The cost of controlling these invasions increases exponentially as the invasion increases. So if you were able to start controlling this invasion at a point while there was still a net positive benefit, you would be able to do so affordably. But typically, control only starts around here when negative impacts are quite badly felt. And often we land up over here where the cost to now deal with this invasion is almost prohibitive. So the message here is, if we could only get people to understand what was about to happen to them, they might change their minds about how they view the problem. Regarding management options, as I said, we involve potential end users from the beginning. We do recognize the need for spatial differentiation of management approaches and the use of best management practices. So involving stakeholders, here's our team under the shady trees somewhere in Tanzania, I think, talking to local people. And we also talk to policymakers in government, and we established county implementation groups, which brought people together from both heavily invaded areas and areas that were only just starting to be invaded, so that they could share ideas and give us advice on how they thought things should be managed. So here's a snowball sampling of the number of stakeholders. We found hundreds of different stakeholders that are involved in one way or another in managing Prosopis. And you can divide them into 4 groups based on whether they have an interest in this problem or not, and whether they are able to influence the problem or not. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you have people who are not really interested and don't have much influence, and they are inconsequential. And you see there's a bunch of them there who are either affected or beneficiaries or people who extract or people who influence or who are government regulators. So that's the color coding there. If you go to the top left-hand corner, you have people with low interest but high influence. And these are highly influential people, but they are disengaged. The bottom right-hand corner is people with low influence, but they are highly interested. And the top is also highly interested and highly influential people. So the way in which you deal with these people has to be different. These people at the bottom here, you can ignore because they don't have much impact on the problem. These people who are highly influential but disengaged, you need to persuade them that this is a problem that is worth engaging with. Here you need to mobilize and coordinate because these are highly motivated and influential people. And here, see what that says. That you can read it probably. That's how you deal with those guys. With regard to best management practices, we stressed the importance of planning, regular monitoring, willingness to change what you are doing if it's not working. And you have to integrate and use all available methods in appropriate combinations. And this includes mechanical, chemical, and biological control methods. Now, when you're dealing with invasions across an area as large as Eastern Africa, you have invasions across the spectrum of spread. So you have some areas in stage 1 where Prosopis has not yet reached that area, but potentially it could become invasive. Stage 2 is where the species are present in an initial incursion, but they're still in low numbers. And then you have stage 3, which is spread, and stage 4, which is dominance. And at the bottom, you can see the management approaches differ. The one area you need to prevent them from getting there. If they are initial incursions, you need to act rapidly, try to extirpate them if you can. Stage 3, you can only really try to contain the spread. And where the species is dominant, you just need to try and protect your assets, your fields, your houses, your schools, whatever it is. And you may consider utilizing the trees because there's no other resource to use, although that's very controversial. So here's some maps that were developed by our team, again, showing different areas in Kenya that need to be to have high priority for either prevention or EDRR, which is early detection and rapid response, or containment and asset protection. Now, the asset protection areas, I don't know if you can see this here, but there's a purple here, and here's purple around Lake Baringa and so on. Those are the really badly invaded areas, and those need to be carefully managed to try and reduce. But you also need to manage these other areas. You need to prevent this problem from getting to new areas, and you need to try and eradicate it if it is still possible in some areas. Biological control. In South Africa, for Proserpis trees, the biocontrollers originally used only seed feeding insects because they didn't want to damage the plant. They thought this is a valuable species, so we'll try and stop it from spreading by attacking the seeds, but we don't want to attack the plant. And it's only now that they're starting to change that attitude. The Australians, on the other hand, had a much greater success with biological control because they imported from the start more damaging insects that would attack the plant itself. And this is a quote here from the latest biological control review for South Africa that said, we've included these more damaging agents to damage the vegetative growth because it's now recognized that there's no other route to the successful management of Proserpis. If we don't use biological control in our toolkit, we're not going to get on top of this problem at all. And this assessment holds for East Africa as well. Utilization as a control method. People are saying, well, we've got this invasive tree here, we might as well use it. And we can probably control it through using it. And this is still widely in the literature today, widely considered a nuisance. The shrub is now a sustainable energy bio option. You know, that kind of thing you find often in the literature. And as I said earlier, the Kenyan government adopted a policy of control through utilization after the court judgment against them. But despite this, the spread continued unabated. So clearly utilization cannot achieve control, but it can generate some value where control is no longer possible. But please don't utilization with control. Utilization is not a control method that works. And here you can see, going back to our maps around Lake Baringa, the spread in 2002, and in 2009, that is exactly when the government introduced their kilns and gave the locals opportunities to turn all of these invasions into charcoal and make some money out of it, which they did, but it didn't stop the spread. You can see in 2016, there was no effect on stopping the spread at all of doing the utilization. We also faced with this harebrained bond challenge, which is to bring 150 million hectares of degraded and deforested landscape into restoration. And you can go and read, there are a number of papers out there now which saying what the substantial challenges and problems are with this. First of all, it regards all landscapes without tree cover as degraded. and grasslands and savannas are certainly not degraded landscapes. It doesn't consider the negative impacts of replacing these landscapes with trees, such as on water resources, biodiversity, and so on. It doesn't clearly differentiate between an invasive tree and a non-invasive species. It doesn't consider the albedo changes, so you're changing a light-colored surface to a dark-colored surface, and that absorbs more heat. There's been some recent studies that also shows that the net carbon gain of this scheme is not going to be realized. But everybody's got the bit between their teeth, and you find now that I think it's Saudi Arabia is giving enormous amounts of money to African countries. I think Zimbabwe has now just sold off 10% of its land surface to be planted with trees. That's 10% of their land that's going to be put into non-productive use, so that some countries can continue to sell oil. It's just crazy. And what leads to the confusion around the value of trees is that the Kenyan constitution actually has a requirement to increase the tree cover to 10% of the country. So it's a constitutional requirement. National strategies, we've now been talking to these three governments, and they have all recently developed national strategies, and they have broad agreement on a number of issues. But if you look at the weaknesses at the bottom there, they're all framing their goals in terms of inputs instead of outputs. We're going to spend so much money on this. That's an input. They don't say what the outcome is intended to be. Or they are setting unrealistic targets. I think the Ethiopian strategy said we'll get rid of this problem in 5 years. There's no way that they're going to get rid of it in 5 years. There are no indicators to assess progress. There's lack of clarity about both biological control and utilization, which are really important things that you should be quite decisive about in your approach to managing this problem. Looking forward, some key questions. Can we control these invasions sustainably? I think the really important issues here are whether we should promote this utilization or not, whether we should make use of biological control, and whether we can convince some of these developmental aid agencies not to use invasive species, because they are still doing that. And the other big question is, where will the funding come from to manage this? I'm going to end with a kind of scenario, the way that I think things may go. And scenarios use normally two axes, and at the bottom I've said you needed what degree of consensus you have on the appropriate approach. Which approach should we use biocontrol or not? Should we use utilization or not? Should we fund this as a priority area? And then you'd have high or low consensus on that approach, and then the level of funding that you actually manage to fund. So if you don't get any funding and you don't have any consensus, then that's you've lost. Prosopis is going to become dominant over others, and the negative impacts will be maximized. If you do secure a lot of money, but you can't agree on how to go about this, your funds will be diluted to meet goals, and you will lose efficiency. You'll get frustrated. If you do have a high degree of consensus on how to approach this, but you cannot secure enough money, then you're going to have to practice triage. You're going to have to focus on those areas that you can save at the expense of not focusing on others. Because if you try to spread the funding that you've got too thinly, you will be ineffective everywhere. And then finally, if you have high consensus and high funding, then you can restore many of these ecosystems that are currently invaded, or you can prevent them from becoming invaded. So we could make good progress towards our goals if we can get this right. This is just some advertising. We're currently working on a book which arises from this project. It will be published by CABI. hopefully later this year, in which we've summarized most of the stuff that I've talked about now. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. All right, I will now open the floor for questions. So I'm just going to keep an eye on the chat box here to see if there are any questions, or please feel free to raise your hand. Muthama, thank you very much. Please go ahead with your question.
Asante sana, Brian, for that talk, and it takes me into an area of frustration and also acknowledge a lot of work that has gone into it. But my questions are twofold. One, my impression of Prosopis invasion is that it covers the ecozone of acacias. So while you've given a picture of Prosopis perhaps invading all of East Africa, do you think it will get into the montane system? So that's part of it. The other part is, it's a comment. In 1976, the Food and Agricultural Organization put lots of money into Kenya and East Africa as part of reforestation. And I think the global community has not acknowledged the harm they have done to Africa. And now they want to force us to plant trees, or incentivize us, or bribe our leaders to plant trees where there should not be trees. What lessons can we take from here to prevent such a catastrophe happening 50 years from today? Thank you.
Regarding your question about whether they will spread to some areas, there've been quite a few studies that have used climatic models, for example, to look at the potential area that could become invaded. And I think that some of those are published, and yeah, you're right. It's not the whole of Africa that will get covered in Prosopis trees. It's mainly the arid and semi-arid areas where this plant thrives and becomes dominant. But that still is a huge proportion of the area that we're talking about. How can we persuade the world not to plant trees? Well, I don't know. I know that some scientists are trying their level best to attack this notion. I know my friend and colleague William Bond is one of them. But it takes quite a while. It took quite a while to persuade the world that they should plant trees in the first place, and now they're doing it. And many countries have latched onto it as a way of justifying their continued use of oil. So it's a difficult problem to deal with, because that has now got momentum. And I'm afraid many African countries are probably giving their land away because there is some kind of kickback for them in the short term. So yeah, that's a big problem. We need to work very hard to persuade our own governments to realize that this is not a solution to their problems.
Thank you, Brian. While I've still got you, recently I read that you can make coffee, or someone in South Africa is making coffee out of Prosopis. Could this be the next gold?
Yeah, look, I certainly don't want to drink Prosopis coffee. So I think there won't be you can, there's quite a big market for making animal feed and animal feed supplements from Prosopis pods that I think would be far than the coffee angle. But again, it comes down to what's the net benefit or what's the net loss. If you add up the value of all of the damage that this plant creates, and you throw the amount of money that somebody's going to make out of selling a few coffee beans, it's very, very small.
All right, thank you for those responses. I'm going to take some questions from the chat box. Firstly, Prof. William Bond says, brilliant analysis and great talk. Many thanks.
Thank you, William.
Stephanie van der Merwe asks whether there are projects in South Africa that's monitoring Prosopis invasions.
Yeah. There's certainly an attempt at the moment, which is driven by Rhodes University, the Center for Biological Control, and Philip Ivey in particular, who is trying to get something going. But at the moment, I don't know of any monitoring program. I do know that Elna van der Berg, probably 15 years ago now, did a master's degree on mapping all of the Prosopis invasions in the Northern Cape. But I don't know of any follow-up work on that yet, not in the Northern Cape. And that's where most of our Prosopis trees are in South Africa.
Right. Prof. William Bond also asks, is Prosopis a problem native invader in its home range?
I believe it is. You know, you get sometimes indigenous plants that become what we call bush encroachers. You know, you get bush thickening as a result of a number of factors. You know, there's less fire in the environment. There's overgrazing, which leads to less grass, which leads to less competition for the trees. And then you get carbon dioxide fertilization, which makes the trees grow faster than the grasses. So if you combine these things, you get bush thickening. And I believe that's happening in the Americas as well with Prosopis. Yeah.
Right. Thanks. Alana posted some information about Mana Brew, the coffee there. Graham asked,
has she had any of it to drink yet?
I'm not sure. But there's some useful information about that there, the value of it. Alana hasn't tasted it yet, so it's still out. The verdict is still out. And then Graham asked whether it can work to clear one site and then plant indigenous plants to outcompete the invasive species, the invasive trees.
It can work. You can either try to re-establish a natural vegetation cover, or you can try to establish a crop, some kind of useful crop, which is happening in a lot of areas in Eastern Africa. But the question is at what scale? You know, you can probably do that on a relatively small area, but once you want to do it over, you know, the Serengeti National Park, then it becomes prohibitively expensive. That's why you need biological control. You know, it's if you don't have that, you're going to fight a losing battle.
Right. And are there more aggressive biological control agents released in South Africa yet? Or is it still just the seed feeding insects?
No, there's one that's been released now. It's a leaf tying moth. It's been very successful in Australia. And we're not sure, it's too early to say how successful it's going to be here, but we're hoping that it's as successful as in Australia. And then potentially there are many others. They just need to be found and tested and released.
And hopefully still work with climate change, etc.
Well, no, that's another spanner in the works, but yeah.
Right. All right. Here's another question. Someone's just asking about how to get the recording. We will make the recording available of the webinar here on the SAAB's website. So that will be available there. All right, we're close to I just check if there's any hands or any other questions here. Not seeing anything. So yeah, that just leaves me then to thank you. If there's any closing comments that you want to make, Prof. van Wilgen?
No, thank you for the opportunity. I think it's always useful to get these ideas out as much as you can. A lot of work has gone into it, not just me, but many other people's work. And hopefully, when our book comes out, it's going to be open access. It's going to be freely available for downloading, so people can read up about this work there.
Fantastic. Yes, these kind of multidisciplinary studies are exceptionally valuable, and I hope that we can continue that kind of trend and do more of these. And we're looking forward to that book. So good luck with finishing that off. That's also
so am I can tell you.
Right.
Yeah.
But again, thank you so much for your time. We know that your time is precious, but it's so valuable for us to learn from your wisdom. So we really appreciate that. And thank you also to the audience for attending. And I hope that we see you all at the next webinar as well. Adeyemi, do you want to say anything, or can I close off?
Sorry, I was on mute. No, thank you so much, Anina. Thank you so much, Prof. We really appreciate your time. I think this has been very impactful. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you, Anina.
Pleasure.
Back to you.
All right. That's all for tonight then. Thank you everybody for attending, and hope you have a good week further. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Cheers.
Bye-bye.